Welcome to the Sound Bites podcast. I'm your host, Nick, and today we have Rob Broadhead. Excuse me, I'm going to butcher that already. We have Rob Broadhead with us here, who Rob's a seasoned software developer and technology professional. His background includes over 30 years of development. It includes enterprise systems on a wide variety of system architectures and platforms, and his roles have included staff developer, director of development, architect, database administrator, and many, many other hats that he would have wore at one time. He founded RB Consulting as a software development and implementation consulting company. However, after witnessing many poorly planned and designed projects, he altered the business focus. The primary focus is helping customers create well-designed project plans and navigate the vast sea of technology. This includes building teams, departments to address IT needs in the future and for today. And so with that, welcome, Rob. Great to have you here.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Yeah. So can you expand a little bit more on your background there? It sounds like what you ran into is starting in one place and ended up in another.
Yeah, I started I think where most people in the software world, you're either products or services. Either you're out there and you're customizing stuff, or you're building software, building custom applications. My background was application. That's still my first love, I guess, professionally, is I like building software from this ground up, building the whole thing. And as I got into initially looking at building software and working with different companies and coming in different stages, I found out more often than not what was happening is I was coming in like in round two. They would go through, they would have some company come in or an individual or whatever. They would build stuff and there'd be a lot of mistakes. There'd be a lot of things that were just oversights, or a lot of times they just didn't really all know what they were building. And that's the consultants, but it's also the businesses. Sometimes the businesses are like, hey, we've got a problem to solve. And it wasn't until they got deep into it that they realized that maybe they hadn't specified it right, or the consultants hadn't asked the right questions. The example I often use is if you go to somebody and say, hey, I need you to build me a house, that's a very broad thing. And most of us, physically, we know there's a difference between like a little 1-bedroom thing and some 40-bedroom, 80-bathroom mansion.
That's right.
And if you don't have at least the ballpark, you can't even start. And then if you don't know things like in building a house, things like where do you put your heating and air? How big does it need to be to support what you've got? Do you need to have lights in certain places? Do you need to have electrical plugs in certain places? Do you need to have certain types of electrical plugs? These days, you have to have something to plug in your electric vehicle. And that's what people are running into in software. And I realized that I wanted to get a little more in I guess it's almost like education side of that consulting, is get into companies a little sooner and say, hey, I can help you. And I would be glad to help you with implementation and building these things out. But I think you really need to think about where you're at and where you're going first. And that started to cover a lot of other things, because it's not just building software. It's not just writing code at that point. It's things like, is it worth it to build it? Would you be better off buying a solution? If you're buying a solution, or if you're using consultants, how do you find the right one for you? Going through an RFP process or vendor evaluations. What are you going to do once you're done? Do you need them to support it, or do you need to build an organization where you have staff that can support it, or maybe even be part of building it? And there's a lot of questions that it's one of those, you start with a couple of questions. It's sort of like, where are you at? What are you thinking? Yeah. And it's almost like unpeeling an onion. As you go in, you say, oh, if you want to do this, then we have some more questions for you. And then as those get answers, we have other questions to help build a detailed enough picture of where you are, where you want to be, and what are your resources to get there? Because sometimes there's a small business, they would love to have the top flight, get the Porsche, but they really can't afford, but like the little Honda, and the Honda sometimes is what they want. It's really a better suited thing. The Porsche may be flashy, but what they need for their business is the Honda, not to besmirch or promote any of those brands, of course.
Right.
And that was where I said, I'm going to shift my focus a little bit. Instead of just trying to like get out there and look at projects and sort of later in the process, switch gears and try to get earlier into the process and try to find companies that are just getting started. And it does work out. It's a lot more. It's like entrepreneurs and solopreneurs and companies that are just into that period where they say, hey, we've got an idea or we have a need. Now we want to move forward. And it's, some of it's like this sort of educating is trying to say, hey, if you haven't done it before, you probably need to talk to somebody that has, just so you understand what questions to ask.
I love where this conversation is going already, because when what you're talking about there, so this is where I'll say this is the only path where IT and programming can actually cross, because a lot of people just kind of assume they're one bubble, and they're definitely not. Well, I shouldn't even say they're definitely not. There's some crossover, but that's usually where it gets very confusing and gray. But what I will say, what they are spot on the same on, is you transform yourself from an IT advisor, a programmer, to a business analyst. I mean, that's what you're talking about there. I mean, you're talking about analyzing a business and really bringing them out what's your next 5 or 10 years look like? I mean, let's plan this and think a little bit behind the scenes. Don't think about what buttons you're going to click. What do you want your processes to be? Now, that's a very different question.
And it felt more, it was more real in the IT, and I guess in the general IT world 10, 20, 30 years ago, because people had to think about, if I'm going to buy servers, if I'm going to lay down, put in phones and put in networking. And that stuff all still applies to all of this. But now you have things that I think although it simplifies it, it also can complicate it in a way, is that you have like, Azure and AWS and Google, and you have all these cloud providers and all of these solutions that sell turnkey, one-stop, buy as you go. And all of that's valid and very valuable to small companies, but you still need to be asking the same questions, because you need to, even though you're, paying $10 a month right now, flash forward 5 years, when you expect to be doing enough business, you're going to spend $10,000 a month. You want to make sure that you've got the right vendor, that you've looked far enough ahead, and that the one that is the cheap solution that works for you early on, that is going to be able to grow with you, and that's going to match your needs.
Right. I mean, you even brought up a great thing there with AWS, Azure, and Google. Frankly, I don't know if anybody's actually taken the time to look at their service offerings. But even in my role, and I won't speak for you, but in my role, I look at their service offerings. I'm like, what the heck is that? I mean, there are so many services they offer, and the naming conventions they come up with. I mean, you almost need to dig around quite a bit to even understand it, and the terminology on top of that. It's a very difficult process. So I can easily see why your services are required, because it's confusing out there.
Yeah, it was that one. AWS in particular is sort of a funny one, because I did a series of blogs or a podcast, I can't remember which it was, but where I was just going to walk through each service, each episode, and just talk about it. It's basically looking at what they had, and there's stuff out there. There's like satellite communication stuff. There's all kinds of AI stuff. There's just, and then you get into it and you start realizing the rhyme and reason to the names a little bit, but it's always growing. And it was funny that I think there's probably 70 services or something when I started it. By the time I got done, they'd added 20 or 30 more. So what, I originally thought, okay, I'm going to go through all of these. I was going through and I was like, checking stuff off that I'd done. I'm like, wait, that's new. You'd have and especially once a year or twice a year, they'll have a conference, and there's like a dozen things that get dropped. It's like, it is by itself for some of those. And Microsoft's same way. Even if you look at the anybody that's Office 365, if you get on their email, they'll send you something. I think it's every week that you get something like, hey, here's some new services, and they've got new products, new services, new features. It really is something that even if you're in it, it's hard to keep up. But if you're not, if you're a CEO, CFO, if you're doing accounting or HR or whatever, you don't have the time to keep up with that kind of stuff. And sometimes there's very key changes in the market that give you suddenly a solution that maybe didn't even exist for you 6 months or a year ago.
That's a great point, because you're spot on. Even our experts today gotta take a lot of time just to keep up with those changes, let alone continue to learn everything about that ecosystem. It's incredible. So on that note, you talked a little bit about this. What led you to your purpose of, like, why did you start consulting? Why not just work for some big industry, some big name out there? What's the reason? What's the rhyme and reason for that?
I'd say the original reason was I always, even as a child, I liked being able to just be self-directed, to just work for myself. I was a kid that in school, the teachers would say, "Here's the instructions, here's how you do it," and I would get dinged because I would do it I'd have a different way to do it. Sometimes it was better, sometimes it was worse, but it was something that I just liked. Challenges. I didn't like I didn't like that structure to the level where it's like, all right, just color in the lines and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to do something a little different. I always liked having that challenge of, hey, here's an open-ended thing, go figure out a solution.
Mm.
And consulting worked really well in general. I started out working for a couple of big consulting companies,
Mm-hmm.
and it worked out good in a sense because it allowed me to constantly be moving to different projects, and I never felt like I was in a rut or anything was getting stale or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But then that also made it just made it easier for me as it got further along into my career, where I could say, you know what, this is something I can do. I'm comfortable with it, and I wouldn't mind trying it. And then actually it was a little bit of a twist of fate or something like that, as I was working for a startup company that ran out of funding. And it was something where the CEO would come by every other Friday, come by Friday afternoon. If you're in the office, he'd give you your check.
Mm-hmm.
I happened to be in the office that day, and he came by and he's like, "Oh, we don't have checks. We didn't get, we had some funding that fell through. We can't afford to pay you." Most people, that's an impetus to like go look for another job. It's like, I don't care how good your job is, if they're not going to pay you, there's a point you're like, hey, I've got bills to pay and stuff like that. And reached out to somebody I'd worked with just a year or two before and said, "Hey, I'm sort of looking for stuff." They said, "Oh, funny thing, we just had a couple more positions open. We'd love for you to come in." And as a consulting, it was it's a consulting position. And basically the arrangement there was such that they said, "Well, we really need you to be incorporated," and things like that. So I went, got an S corp built, and now I have suddenly I have a consulting company with an employee of me. And I had a great customer to start out with. Of course, first day I started, everything's great. The second day was actually 9/11, 2001.
Oh, wow.
So everything changed dramatically, sort of like, for those that weren't around, sort of like what happened when COVID hit, a couple of years ago. Market changed a lot, but survived through that. And then sort of went back and forth with there are a couple of times that I had good offers as an employee over the next, about 10 years. And then finally got, just for other reasons, because of just being able to control my own schedule and having my own flexibility and being able to reach the kind of customers that I could reach individually, made a lot more sense than whoever I was working for at a given time. Because there's a lot of people, there's a lot of small companies in particular that they just can't afford. They're not going to go to, Accenture or KPMG or something like that. And some of that, they need to know some of the skills you're going to get from a big and wide, deep experience company. And they can't afford somebody, they can't afford to get a CTO in or something like that. So it works out best for me. I can come in and spend a smaller amount of time, so it's a lower overall cost, and give them that benefit so that at least they can jump forward. And then I've built, sort of grown the company since then as well, so that I've got I have higher end services that I do as far as vision and planning and things like that. And then I've also got developers that I've trained up that are high quality, low cost, but not offshore or anything. So it covers all of their concerns and lowers the cost dramatically. It's not, nobody wants to pay me to write code, because it's just not gonna be that much better to be worth what it's going to cost. And it allows me to give them good resources, trusted people they can work with to build the quality solution they need.
So, I mean, you mentioned the whole 9/11 deal, second day. That's a pretty big challenge to overcome. I mean, first off, what a weird time. It really just overthrew everything in our social lives, and it changed the way airports are run. It changed quite a bit. So what kind of challenges did you face going through something like that? Or what other challenges beyond the incident of 9/11 and the market change? What other challenges did you process and work through?
Well, it really, I was talking to somebody the other day about that. most businesses, small businesses fail, especially consulting type things, solopreneur things fail early on because there wasn't enough of a runway. There wasn't enough planning. They get to a point where they're great for 6 months or a year, and then business drops off and they're not ready for that. And for me, it was like, bam, day 2, things changed. And so I immediately had to consider that, hey, I may be looking for a job again in a week or 2 weeks. Cause I knew a couple of the team we had. I think we had about 15 or 16 people that was the team. I knew a couple, they dropped right away. So, like one girl came in, started that day, went to lunch and they said, okay, we don't need you anymore. It was like, it was that quick a turnaround. So I was already sort of keeping things closer to the vest. I was like, all right, I got to make sure I've got enough runway for this. I got to make sure that I don't go nuts and, overspend myself or anything like that. I got to make sure that I've got enough revenue coming in that I can cover the bills I need to pay. And so there was a lot learned early on about planning for the long term, as opposed to just, it's sort of the feast and famine that business can be sometimes. It's just saying, oh, hey, everything's great, I'm going to assume it's going to happen forever. And that's not the case. So that was it was an excellent learning experience early on. And then a lot of it too was finding ways, they talk now about pivoting and things like that, but that's a lot of what it was. I was brought in to be this smaller cog in this big team. And I had to adjust fairly quickly to say, no, I can be a bigger cog in a very small team, and ended up being one of the last 2 people that were there because I was able to, adapt and was looking ahead at that, saying, oh, I need to make sure I, basically let them know I can do this and I can do that and I can do this other thing that now I know you're getting rid of those people, but I can at least help backfill. I can't do it as good as they can, but at least it's one of those, like everything else, when resources start to shrink, you'll take somebody that can at least somewhat do it over the expert, because you can't afford the expert right now.
Right. And so what you described there, it takes a lot of work. I mean, a lot of work and time and energy. So how do you balance out, starting and then growing the business with home life? How did that ratio work out for you? How were you able to overcome that?
Well, that's one that I have learned over the last 20 something years that I've been doing this. At that time, it was, fortunately, I was in a good enough position. So I had a wife that worked from home, even though I had 3 kids. So she did the kids, dealt with all of that, and freed me up to build the business and things like that. Over the years, there were things like you have those moments where you're working so hard and you realize, I'm missing stuff at home. I'm missing stuff with my family. And so I would make adjustments, and then eventually got probably halfway into it, 8 to 10 years later. And part of it too was just like my wife had passed away at that point, and so that changed a lot as well, and sort of forced me into a position where it was like, okay, I've got to. And I knew it was she was sick for a while, so it allowed me to change my focus and really get more disciplined, really, about business and how I did stuff and how I did working in the business and working on the business and getting away, having the ability to just get away from it, because even then it wasn't as bad as it is now, but there was enough wireless and cell phones and stuff like that was also easy to work 24/7, or at least feel like you were.
No doubt. Wow. I mean, that would have been quite a challenge to overcome. And I'm sorry, I missed that timeline there. How many years of business were you working when your wife had passed?
It was about 8 years at that point.
Well, that's a critical junction. I mean, just thinking strictly from the business side of things, there's a lot that goes into growing it. And now you have this, that's kind of upending. And you said you had mentioned you had seen it coming, but that's still, those are difficult things to work through for anybody, let alone kind of what you were attempting to do.
Yeah, it's one of those that luckily, I've always been a driven kind of individual, and I've always known that just my personality, I know how to address things and how to build habits and things like that. So I had mentors along the way in companies. I'd seen a lot of sort of, I guess, blessed and cursed. I'd worked at a lot of startup companies that now don't even exist, anywhere. So I was able to see some successes and deal with some people that were very good at what they did. And then I also saw where there were mistakes. And so I was able to take that learn from their experiences, and in some cases avoid, repeating the same mistake. So there was a lot of things that just sort of fell into place for me that made it work. But it was, also it's just one of those, you got to keep your head up. You can't coast at any time in business. You've got to be looking for the next thing and understand that what you've got here could change, at the drop of a dime. And then you've got to, step up and work again, basically find a new way to get through.
Wow. Yeah. What an interesting challenge, because right now, I think what we forget too often, especially when we're just wrapped up in the business world, is that we get a whole relational, personal side of our lives, and seeing how that affects what you bring into work every single day. I mean, that's huge. So I really appreciate you being vulnerable there. I mean, to be able to talk about that openly, I mean, I'm certain was a challenge I cannot even imagine.
Oh, and it does help. Going through something like that, I think also helps dealing with other people. So it did, I think it changed a little bit my perspective through this change. It was I guess a short story. It was a cancer diagnosis. It just, as soon as you get that is, life altering. And then going through that, and then all the things I struggled with, and knowing where I was in business and where I was personally, I think helped me then deal with other people. So there's a lot of situations where you're in business and especially as a consultant, you'll be in a situation where you're like, wow, why is that person acting that way? They you could just say, well, they're just an idiot or something like that. You could brush it off, but then, it causes you to be a little more patient and pause about that, and have some really more grace with other people and say, well, maybe they're having a bad day, or maybe something's going on. And so you don't jump to the worst, and instead you're like, okay, well, let's work with this person. And I've had several professional relationships over the years that I think would not have been as good as they were if I had not been more patient and more just sort of give them the benefit of the doubt. It's like, well, maybe you're having a bad day. Maybe things are going on that I don't see. And so if I can help you out on the business side, then maybe it'll, alleviate some of your issues elsewhere, or allow you to go focus on something else. So it changes how I think you feel, how you view working with customers and working with coworkers and the people that you meet in business. And I think that can be quite a positive to have that kind of understanding and empathy. I guess now it's that they call it your EQ or whatever, but I think it really just comes down to, having some understanding and patience with others.
Yeah. Wow. What a great perspective. And I'd even take it further than just EQ. I mean, I would say we were talking about there is building an entire culture around connection and relationship. I mean, that is huge. I mean, right now people are writing entire books and business classes about this exact thing that you've been able to do. So that's really, really neat to see how, a little bit of trial, I say a little bit, that's all perspective, but some trials go your way and you're able to kind of work through it, that maybe doesn't feel the greatest, but coming out the other side, the lessons and how you go from there are very impactful, not only for you, but for those around you. It's incredible.
Yeah. And I think that is something that I've found with a lot of successful people, and that I've tried to adopt as well, is that whether you've gone through something, or whether you are going through something, it's looking at that as an opportunity to say, yeah, I mean, it may stink right now. It may be rough. It may be hard, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel, that I can look back at those kinds of things and say, yeah, that was really a rough time, but these are the positives came out of it. And I think when you do that, it changes your ability to get through it. It changes your attitude. You're less likely to sit in it as you are to say, okay, this is temporary, so I'm going to keep moving. So maybe I can get through this a little bit faster and get to that light at the end of the tunnel, as opposed to, maybe sit a little bit longer and dwell on, oh, I'm in a bad place. It's more like, hey, I'm going to look for a future place. There's my oldest son actually his name's Tim, and he refers to it as future Tim's problem. He's like, I've got stuff today. This is something that I'll deal with in the future. And it's simple and a little bit funny in a way, but I'm like, wow, that's actually a pretty wise way to approach it. It's the idea that, hey, I've got stuff right now. I can use tomorrow as either to say, hey, this is something hopeful that I'm in a bad place now, but I'll be in something better tomorrow or next week, or to just push stuff off. It's like, I could worry about tomorrow today, but I got enough today. So I'll just let that, I'll get to it when I get to it.
Wow, that's fantastic. And so you went through all of this, and now you decide I'm going to start a second business. Can you tell us more about that second business?
Yeah, this goes to the being a consultant that wasn't doing as much implementation. I would sort of go in, I would help them find companies and deal with vendors and deal with service providers of various sorts. And one of the things I was running into, it's actually, I guess, two things I was running into. One was how bad job postings and requirements often were. You go talk to a recruiter and you'd see a posting and it had nothing. It was just it's sort of like a dartboard of technology skills and buzzwords, and it doesn't really tell you anything. And so I'd look at stuff like, oh, you're posting for, what kind of positions are you going to hire? And they would tell me, I'm like, I don't know what any of this is. I could get you 1,000 different applicants that could fit that, and they would be dramatically different. So part of it is understanding, is educating a little bit more on IT language, the lingo, whether you're, and it varies a little bit. It's very specific. If you're like a database guy, if you're a network guy, if you're a software guy, there are certain words that have certain meanings to you there. And it's just like any other profession. Doctors have their own language and lawyers have their own language, and IT is no different. And then also it was, on the other end of that is getting resources that were good. There was a lot of, I was running into a lot of situations where people they'd had some level of education, but there was maybe some theory that they were missing, or some practicality that they were missing. There were these gaps, and it made it very difficult to take entry and sort of junior roles and grow them into something bigger. And some companies weren't doing that. They didn't have like a mentor or lead kind of program to develop that up. And so that was where myself and another guy that I was working with, we created Developreneur, which is really just to take a lot of that knowledge that we have, and then a lot of what we get by researching just current technology and things like that, and then try to use that through mentorship and through blogs and through the podcast to share that information out, and to do as much as we can to sort of to pour back into people and find ways to train them up. Sometimes it's more like we can point them to certification programs and things like that. Sometimes it's stuff where it's like, you just need to, if you spend an hour looking at this results that we got, this stuff that we cleaned up out of a couple of searches, what you need to know. We're not going to go bog you down with 6 months of a study on something when we can, distill it down to an hour or two because of where you're at and what your knowledge is. You can take that and run with it. And so it's almost like a feeder program. I look at in some ways to bring people onto the consulting side, is go, help have some content, have a way to build people up and give them some of those core skills. So now they can go out and essentially go be consultants on their own.
Oh, it's really interesting. I feel like you went out there and you started at a application/programming company, but we ended up with was 2 business consulting companies.
Yeah.
I mean, not quite, but to that point, it almost is exactly that. And so that's a really unique angle. And frankly, that's, if anybody's going to learn anything, I would highly suggest that your story is one that many entrepreneurs can learn from, because really at the end of the day, you're not just selling, a very highly specific service. So for example, you're not just selling programming, you're selling a relationship, something more, something strategic. There's a lot to that. And I say the same thing for myself, as I look at IT services, like, okay, yeah, we want to be strategic. We want to develop something for the future, a long-lasting relationship, something that you can build upon for the future. I mean, that is so much more. And so many people just kind of run into it with this like one idea. I'm going to sell this one idea, and they don't really know how to take hold of it and to make it something more. So I do love that example, seeing what you've done there and coming out of that and some of the successes that you've had.
And I think it's a different perspective, as you say, like if you come in with IT services and you solve their problem today, then it may guarantee that they're going to call you back 6 months because they're going to have different problems and they're going to have you come in. But it's more of like a partnership with your customers, and to say, look, I'm going to help you with today, but we're going to talk about 6 months. We're going to talk about 3, 5 years down the road, and we're going to do our best to position you so that you can grow along that path. You may need us along the way. You may not. It may be something we can put things in place and they'll grow. And then we get to, we'll ride off into the sunset, and you are very happy with us. And it's serving the customer more than you're serving the business, I think, in that case.
Oh, I would agree with that. And frankly, it's going to be a relationship that goes both ways. Because frankly, as you're helping to develop them, they're going to help develop you. They're going to give you more opportunity as you give them more opportunity. And so people only think it's a one-way street. Well, anybody in business is going to tell you it needs to be a two-way street, or else you're liable to fail. Mm-hmm. That's just the truth.
Well, and I think that too, is that you get a lot. Each customer, as you learn about them and their business, you now get to take that and you know more about that industry. You have yet another example of how somebody does it. So when you go to your next customer, you can say, you're very similar to this other thing that I ran into. Here's a solution that worked for them. So it saves everybody, because now they're not having to spend as much time with you getting up to speed, because now you've already got that. You've got that foundation of knowledge to now help them in their business.
That's great. And I can 100% affirm that. That's happened to me on a weekly basis. XYZ happened over here. We'll plan over here. And that's kind of the beauty. In some of this consulting work, you don't get so pegged up in a silo, where it sounds like, frankly, you're able to expand your horizons as you get to interact with different business and their business models.
Mm-hmm. Oh, very much so. It is. That's part of what's become more of the fascination as I've become more of as you sort of like a business analyst and business services, business consulting, is expanding into different areas of business. In some cases, I had no knowledge of that business before I got into something with the customer, and then got educated along the way. And it's like, wow, that's fascinating. I had no idea that business was that complex or deep.
Right. Oh, yeah, spot on. So as we kind of look towards just the last part of this conversation, I kind of wanted to open it up for you to two things, actually. I want two things from you. What's one thing you kind of want people to walk away from this with? And then the second part to that is, how can people reach out to you if they have any more questions? Just a good contact information.
I think for somebody walking away with it from this, what I would just like to, for them to know is that there are, if you're in the world of IT, whether you're building a product, whether you're some sort of a manager or something like that, it is complex, and it is worth it. Just like a medical procedure where you might want to get a second opinion or talk to somebody that's done it before, I think is very valuable. And I think there's a lot of companies. I've noticed a lot of consulting companies of various sorts within IT. You can get 30, 60-minute free consultation stuff. I offer one of those, just 30 minutes, just to sit down and talk with you to help you understand, so you at least know a little bit more that you don't know coming into it. I think it's very worth it to do it. And even if you're in IT, it's good to do a regular review or check it, just sort of like, what do I know? What are maybe some areas where there are changes in my area of expertise that I've been busy and haven't been able to keep up on. So it's something I think everybody is served by, sort of staying a little bit current and getting an idea of what's out there in the IT world. You don't have to know it in depth, but spending a little bit of that time is very valuable. As far as getting a hold of me, there's a couple different ways. The consulting site, rb-sns.com. And there's a contact, there's the free, you can go schedule a free 30-minute call, and we can talk in depth. You can get me, Rob, at email, rob@rb-sns.com. You can get me for any questions on the consulting side there. And then there's also Developreneur, develpreneur.com. So it's a combination developer and entrepreneur there. That's the education side. And actually you can sign up there. We also have school.developreneur.com that we've got some courses and free stuff and free and up to paid courses. And we are every month adding stuff. That's a newer piece. We're every month adding stuff to that to try to get something that's just a little quicker to consume, to understand, better better focused content. But then the main developer on our site, we've got the podcast and blog articles for, from several years back. So there's a lot of content out there that you can do a little bit of searching and find probably something on just about anything you're asking, including all of the AWS services. If you want, and it's dated now because, it didn't just finish yesterday. So it's probably 50 more services since that was created.
You're probably right. I'd be curious to see a blog article post about that.
Yeah.
What's changed?
That may be worth it. Just this is what's changed in this period of time.
Oh man, it'd probably be a 10-pager, but I digress. Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining us today. One thing I would say to anybody listening, I'll make sure all your information is posted. That way people with, just want to double check that contact information, I'll make sure that's posted along with the podcast episode. So please feel free to check that out. Thanks again, Rob. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot, Nick. It was great great being here.
Yeah, great. Well, hey, you take care.
Thank you. You too. Have a good one.